Welcome to another episode of Catalyzing Radical Systemic Change, wherein on my own language, it's all about discovering, mapping, and cross-pollinating the various building blocks towards a planetary civilization ahead. Like so often in my podcast, today's topic will be investing, money, and how that ties into this like big consciousness shift we're all becoming aware of. So as I've often been sharing, I strongly believe we're a threshold generation. With that, I mean, many of us are becoming aware that instead of perpetuating the extractive systems at large that we see out there, and that we can talk a lot about, for me, it's more about sharing signs of hope. And with signs of hope, I mean, there's a big reckoning throughout like all different parts of society that we can and need to rewire the systems. And with systems, I really mean the invisible infrastructure upon which like our everyday society is built upon. So before unveiling my distinguished guests and like then always diving into her pivotal moments in her biography, I wanted to mention a feature that became somewhat prominent in the last 1.5 years when my podcast became a little bit more popular. It's like I get a bunch of people like reaching out to me. There's a bunch of people who are publishing books, and many of those requests I refuse. Many of them because I don't feel they're grounded in lived experience. So when Jenna came around the corner and we were preparing the podcast, I really saw this beautiful, let's say, human creature, human soul, using the book as an expression to digest the experience of herself in her biography and also being an investor. So, Jenna, like always in the podcast, I would like for the listeners to get a more like 3D, 4D, 5D understanding of who you really are and share the pivotal moments in your biography, ideally tying some of those pivotal moments back to the topic of today's podcast. So the floor is yours. Delighted to listen in.
Amazing. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today and be part of this conversation. And there's so much in what you shared that really resonates with me. I'm part of the Baha'i community, and there's this concept in the Baha'i writings around the fact that we're living in a stage of adolescence. And I think what you shared around the threshold generation, it really makes me think about that. And I think so much of my life and so many of the pivotal moments in my life has been, how do we think about, and exactly as you sharing in terms of hope, like what does it mean in the complexity of the world that we're living in to actively cultivate a sense of possibility and hope. And so I grew up in London. I was raised by my mother and grandmother, and actually my book is dedicated to them, and they continue to be, even though they've passed on to the next world, a huge part of the inspiration for me for all that I do. And I think being exposed that both of them were entrepreneurs and were incredible guiding lights, and really helped to foster in me a sense of responsibility and the idea that we're only in this world for a short period of time, and how do we use the limited time that we're here to really be of impact. And I came out to the US, I did my undergrad and MBA at Stanford, and my whole career has been in this area of social responsible investing and really trying to channel resources towards communities and people that have been overlooked and underestimated, and looking at this sort of intersection of personal transformation and systemic transformation. And lived in China and in DC, and spent time in Congo and India, and in each of these places really spending time with the people in the community who are working on the front lines of doing absolutely incredible work, and hold those experiences with me in all that I do. And so I currently lead an investment firm called Lightpost Capital, where we do early stage investing and lower middle market M&A, all with an impact lens. So a lot in climate and healthcare, a lot with the intersection with AI, and co-founded an organization about 10 years ago called Impact Experience, where we do a lot of work bridge building between investors, entrepreneurs, and communities that have been overlooked and underestimated. And this book that just came out recently, Enlightened Bottom Line, that's really looking at exploring the intersection of spirituality and business and investing. And there's a framework that we present in the book, the HEAL framework, that stands for hope, empathy, abundance, and legacy. So your emphasis around hope is a huge part of the book. So many more elements that I'm happy to dive into as part of our conversation, but those are a few that I'll start off with there.
Yeah, so let me ask a couple of questions into your biography, and I want to frame them the following. So, I only, in my later adolescence, only became aware there was something like the Baha'i. So, I don't want to give the listeners a full rundown of the Baha'i, but it's the first time in this podcast I'm talking to somebody that grew up in this religious and spiritual background. And the way maybe it's the most interesting is like my own reckoning, working in investment and finding deal flow and matching capital to deals and scaling companies, has often been that writ large there is a, I think, almost like a double kind of paradoxical um, projection onto capital. So for some, it's like the most important people, heaven, they have the money. It's like these are the most important ones. And the flip side of the coin is it's all bad. So could you share if there's a specific flavor to money, success, and tied to values from your Baha'i background? And
Mm.
if there is a specific moment in your biography that really influenced you deeply?
Mm. No, it's such an important question and one that I think about a lot. And a couple of kind of concepts that come to mind and experiences that I've had that have really reinforced some of these concepts is one is this idea that everything leaves a trace. And particularly when it comes to our economic decisions, whether we're employers or employees, this consideration of what is the trace that we're trying to leave, and the ability for us to create spaces to really reflect on what that trace is and be intentional about how we're trying to manifest that. So that's one really important element. There's also a lot of emphasis on the abolition of extremes of wealth and poverty and the importance of us really looking at contributing towards the abolition of those extremes of wealth and poverty and putting our faith into practice, and this idea that work is a form of worship, and through the ways in which we engage in our work, that we have an ability to really consider what is the ripple effect of our decisions in that way. And I was first kind of really exposed to many of these concepts. Talk about being exposed at a young age. I took part in a program called Transformation for Peace from the ages of 12 to 15, and it was with young people from all around the world, and it was inspired by the Baha'i teachings. And a big part of the focus was around looking at the economic systems in the world and studying many different religious traditions, and in addition to the Baha'i faith, and what those traditions had to say as it related to questions around economics. And it was a part of a broader program after Transformation for Peace, and then also the World Peace Program, and the kind of interplay between economic systems and peace. And I think being with people from all around the world, that growing up in many different social and economic backgrounds, and sort of thinking about this at both a systemic and a personal level, was a big part of what inspired me to want to kind of dive deeper both into the Baha'i teachings, but also how that played out in a global economy.
So it's not often, because usually people take too long, so I try to cut them short on the biographical part, but I still want to stay there. So usually we learn and stack our expertise on top of different stages in life. Like we go to school, we go to university, we maybe for the first time get employed, we start a company, we fail. Can you share in those different stages of development maybe one example where you failed, which was really painful and which reflected and changed the way you wanted to show up? And then maybe secondly, an example, a positive one that really led to you like writing the book?
I love that question in so many ways, in that I think I very much think about this interplay between failure and success. There's a lot in the high ratings around the sort of intersection between crisis and victory. And I think the parallel relationship between of failure and success. And I think about that both at a kind of individual and an organizational level. Interestingly, the first of example that came to my mind was actually, I was in the last few months of my mother's life, was tried to be as present as I could and as supportive, and I feel very blessed that I was able to be there when she passed away. But she was diagnosed with cancer 5 years before she eventually passed away, and was actually at the time told that she only had 6 months left to live. And so the mere fact that she lived for another 4.5 years after that was pretty incredible. But I think during that time, maybe there were moments that I prioritized my work over spending more time with her. And so I think one of the, and I would say failure, but I think it sort of catalyzed me since to be really reflective on how am I spending time with those that I love the most, and that my time is really reflective of my values, right? And my value, and I love my mom more than anything, and yet I think I regret that I didn't spend as much time as I think I could have done with her. And so I think it was a failure in terms of the lack of true alignment between my time and how that was manifest. I mean, my ambitions and my care and love, and how I was actually spending my time. Um, on the flip side, in terms of a success, I reflect on, and I didn't share this as part of my initial bio, but actually one of the things I've done professionally that was one of the most meaningful experiences that I had a chance to be part of was I helped to build a coalition of 170 foundations representing about $50 billion in assets under management that were shifting capital from fossil fuels into new economy solutions. And when we first started this coalition, we had a goal of getting to 50 foundations representing $50 million, and we had this goal, but nowhere near as much as I think we eventually were able to achieve. And it was a part of a broader movement of institutions and individuals really looking at aligning their values with their investments. And it's one of the professional engagements that I feel most excited by, in that really seeing these foundations come together. And rather than, and I think what so often is the case, where the investments that a foundation is making are often disconnected from the grant making that they were doing, that being able to see the importance of that alignment there. And so felt really blessed to be able to play a role in building this coalition, and has continued to be a source of inspiration to me since.
Then I want to start segueing into the book. But before we sketch the book, I already mentioned that in the preparation session. I think a book is a powerful vessel that can create a lot of ripple effects. And it's also a very ancient artifact, right? You can use a million other ways. So why a book?
What's so interesting for me about this whole book process was it really started a few years ago. I was at the retirement party of the co-founder of the Calvert Funds, where I used to work. And the Calvert has been one of the pioneers in the area of social responsible investing. And people were sharing some of the stories of the early days of Calvert, which started in the late 1970s. And there's one story in particular that was shared by Wayne Silby, who started the Calvert Funds and wrote the foreword of my book, and has been a dear friend and mentor and collaborator over the years. And he shared this story, and it was of going to a retreat, a Buddhist retreat in the late 1970s. And they had just started the Calvert Funds, and they had started it as a money market fund, and they were doing very well financially. And at the retreat, they had them reflect on what would it say on your tombstone. And his reflection was, it will say, the man that made 2% more than the next man. And it's like, this isn't the legacy that I want to leave. And so he went back to his colleagues at Calvert and like, we need to make this socially responsible. And Calvert today is a $45 billion pioneer in the space of social responsible investing. But it really came from this moment and this experience. And so I began to think, what would it look like if we were to kind of bring together some of these stories from incredible business leaders and investors that have really catalyzed these transformational moments in their lives into building incredible organizations that are kind of working at a systemic level. And so I started just doing interviews with incredible investors and business leaders, and like, I think there's a book here. So it was a very organic process. And I think, to your point, it was really with this intention of how to be some tools and stories and inspiration for people who are wanting to be thoughtful about some of these topics.
So then, since the space, especially in the last 15 years, I sometimes feel so much a veteran in the space, even though by age and like mid-biography, the space of from conscious capitalism to impact to ESG, there's so many books out there. So there's not advertising for a book. I never advertise for products or services or people. That's really just an exploration. But what do you think is the unique essence, the unique fragrance like of the book if you compare it to the others in the bookshelf?
I think a big part of it really is this emphasis on the spiritual component. I think there are so many incredible books around social responsible investing, and on the flip side, I think there's many beautiful spiritual books. But really the goal and the focus with this book, Enlightened Bottom Line, is how do we bring these two worlds together? And I think part of what seen resonate with people and some of the folks that have read the book and conversations around it is, so often when I began some of these conversations around, how do you think about the intersection around spirituality and business and investing? People would say something to the extent of, I don't really feel like I can talk about it, but, and then they would share these incredible stories. And I think this giving permission for it not having to be something that we have this separation of our work life and our spiritual life, but rather this intertwining between the two. And so I think the book and the kind of the uniqueness of it is that it shares stories and examples to really look at what does that intertwining look like in practice.
So I think spirituality is a complex word. So in my understanding, there's spirituality as a peak experience. There's spirituality as a developmental line that's nascent in most human beings, but that you can cultivate. I would say spirituality is also the access to the divine in whichever shape or form or color or name or not name it is used. So when you say spirituality meets investing, what do you mean with spirituality? Can you give that more color?
Sure. So I really looked at in the word spiritual comes from the Latin spiritus, which literally means to breathe life. And I think this idea of what does it mean to breathe life into our financial systems, into our business systems. And I think so often we can engage with investing and business as these sort of neutral, inert, almost machine-like entities. And this idea of if we breathe life into these systems, how do we then interact with them differently? How can we bring a lens and recognizing, and I very much in the interviews of the book and the examples that I share, a lot of the questions to engage with people is, what does spirituality mean to them? It's to your point, it's a very complex, nuanced word, and I do not believe for a moment that I have a one definition fits all, but rather that how do we create the spaces to even ask people, what does it mean for you, and how do you think about it showing up within your investment and business decision making processes? And that the power of asking and holding those questions is so much of where the opportunity lies. And so this question of like, how do we keep coming back to this breathing of new life is something I come back to a lot.
Like the humility which speaks through the words that I'm perceiving. So breathing life through anything we do, right? And making investment a conscious vehicle for that, instead of dissociating and having a beautiful spiritual life and then doing investment on the side. Can you share some specific examples out of the genesis of the book that gave you the fate and the power to pull through? I mean, you mentioned some pieces here and there, but a lot of people start writing books, but they never finish them. So and usually I reckon you have done this in parallel to investing, social life, family life, like all of it. So what gave you the power to pull through?
It's so interesting because I had so many moments where I was reflecting on, at a meta level, the spiritual process of writing the book. And it, in many ways, the felt like so much of what I was writing about, I was trying to practice at the same time. And I think that I really approached the book as a community focused experience. And I think that's a big part of where the source of strength came from, was doing so in community. The people that I interviewed for the book, many of whom were dear friends and collaborators, and being able to hear from them about how they channeled their spirituality into their work and lives sparked so much inspiration for me to both keep going with the project, but also have new things to experiment within my own life. So, I'll share one example. There's somebody I interviewed for the book, is a dear friend, Scott Schickler, who runs a company called Seven Mindsets, and has been a very successful entrepreneur and also doing amazing work in the education technology space. And I was asking him, to this theme around hope, how does he cultivate a sense of hope and abundance and possibility? And he shared this example of the fact that he has a wand on his desk, and finds that when he's in more of a scarce mindset and feeling more fear-based with the ups and downs of entrepreneurship, that he literally waves the wand and it helps him to cultivate more of this sense of abundance and possibility. And so that inspired me, and I bought a wand, and I now have a wand on my desk. And so, little things like that I think both have been really helpful for me in life in general, but have also really helped me to persevere with the process of bringing the book to life, even when it was difficult.
Then I love meta frameworks, right? So I reckon you're familiar with the framework of a theory of change. So if you take the nuggets out of your book in a theory of change, and you live a good life, you make good returns for yourself, your co-investors, your LPs, however you structure your investments, and at the same time you have a deep influence on society, which is what many non-impact entrepreneurs, I think, starkly underestimate. Because I think if you truly have the yearning in your soul to leave impact, you need to outperform traditional entrepreneurship. It's kind of a heavier lift, right? Because you need to perform, you need to make ends meet, you need to make profits. If not, you can't survive, at least not in the system as we know it, right? And you want to have a deep impact on society. So how would you explain those Lego blocks, I often call them in my conversation, in your
Mm,
theory of change. When this happens, then this happens, then that happens.
mm,
So
mm,
imagine we're playing on a cosmic chessboard, as I always call it. How would you explain your theory of change to the listeners?
mm. I love that. And I love your point about the importance of the outperformance. And I think that's also one of the misconceptions that people often have. And I think this really ties into a theory of change of that it's necessary if you're pursuing impact, that it's always concessionary. And I actually think that we see this sort of full spectrum of returns where there are incredible examples of, and I share some of them in the book, of companies that have really done exactly what you're describing, of companies that have both outperformed the market and are having incredible social and environmental impact. And then, of course, we see on the other side, companies that might be having great social and environmental impact, but aren't generating strong financial returns. And I think that makes it complicated in terms of, as people are thinking about what does impact investing really mean. I think the importance of really looking at that full spectrum and the fullness of different types of financial products and investment strategies to be able to reach the and address the deepest challenges that exist in the world. And so, when I think about a theory of change, there's a line in the high ratings that comes up that says, human in reality is a spiritual being, and only when they live in the life of the spirit are they truly happy. And I think that also comes back to a lot of this inspiration around it. So when we think about, if our fundamental reality is a spiritual reality, then what does that mean in terms of how we embed that within the organizations that we're part of, within the systems change that we're seeking to have? And so coming back to that and this process of action, reflection, and learning, and the feedback loop of that, we are constantly in a process of, we make an investment, we learn from that we apply those learnings to the next investment. And you mentioned humility earlier. I think that there's such an importance in taking and embodying a deeply humble approach to this work, because we are learning as we're doing, and that there's so much more that we can learn in community, and in that process of sharing and reflecting to make each investment more better than the one before on every level. So that's definitely a big part of how I think about the theory of change.
Then another feature of myself and how I think and disentangle and then re-entangle complexity is stacking frameworks or uh, abstractions into each other. So if you look at a theory of change and then you take a bell curve, normal distribution, I would say on the one end of the spectrum, I don't want to ridicule it, but I kind of find it a good dash flawed. You could say, okay, Coca-Cola is the most sustainable company on the planet. Right? There are people who think that, and you will find ratings for that. Or very successfully performing companies that propagate a war all the time are very sustainable, right? So I would say that's one extreme of the spectrum. The other extreme of the spectrum would be people that say money per se is wrong. I'm like kind of in the middle. To specify that for a question would be more for your own portfolio construction, the deals that you have done, the portfolio, like your theory behind your portfolio that wants to have returns, but at the same time have a deep impact. Can you share where you perceive yourself in terms of like how avant-garde, how risk adverse, somewhat more in the middle of the bell curve, or are you building a diversified portfolio so that some of the bets are super hardcore on the impact side and some are more, let's say, on the revenue side? Yeah, and ideally share like 2 or 3 lived examples.
Mm, mm. I think similarly would also put myself in the middle of that bell curve, and I will share a couple of examples of investments that I've engaged in. Also, a lot of my work is working with people to reflect on where they are on that bell curve, or how to think about their portfolio and to your point, maybe some investments that are in one part of the bell curve and others that are in other parts. So I think it's a really important part of the discourse and reflection is to engage around that and to really take a total portfolio approach. And I mentioned earlier around building this coalition of foundations to shift capital from fossil fuels into new economy solutions. And so much of that was from this perspective of, some of these foundations might have been doing environmental grant making, but then with their investments, they were investing in the fossil fuel industry. And so, their investments were kind of directly undercutting the grant making that they were doing. So I think this piece around like, how do we think about alignment across a whole portfolio is something that I really try to think about a lot. A couple of investments that I'll mention that really inspire me within my portfolio. One is a company called Isuzu, and they do incredible work using rental score data as part of the assessment of credit scores. So they enable people that otherwise wouldn't have been able to access home ownership to be able to do so, which, as we know, is one of the key economic drivers. And they're a unicorn and have been done very well financially, but have this deep social impact agenda. And you can see that in every part of the way that they've built the business. They have an Isuzu credo. They talk a lot about this frame around justice, capitalism. And so it's been such an honor to be in community and partnership with the co-founders there from early on in their journey. Another company I'll mention is called Verta Health, and they're focused on reversing type 2 diabetes, and they do so through a lens around community engagement and recognizing that as we're considering the health and well-being of any one individual, the importance of thinking about the community around them as part of the healing journey, and also have done very well financially, but have this deep health impact that they've been able to address as well. So those are a couple of examples that I'll mention, but it's been a really exciting journey to engage with some of these companies.
And if you take the book as a fork in your biography, just randomly making this up, let's assume the process of writing you has changed you more than just on a superficial level. So how has the process of deciding to write the book, writing the book, now publishing the book, influenced your own investment decisions, investment criteria from a total portfolio perspective?
Mm-hmm. One of the key ways that it's impacted has been having more clarity. Now, I think that in so many ways, these concepts have been a part of my ether and way of engaging and thinking about things, but having to actually write a book, and I mentioned earlier around the HEAL framework, that's a key frame within the book of hope, empathy, abundance, and legacy. And each chapter in the book has these reflection questions, and these reflection questions are questions that I come back to all the time within my own investments and business decision making processes. So it's something that I think in maybe before the book, and I love that thought of this being a fork in the road, and I'll be very curious to see how the journey continues to unfold after as the coming months and years unfold. It is that it provided an opportunity to really take a lot of these concepts and put them into a clear pathway that is just as much about inquiry as it is about the answers, right? I think that's a key part of both sort of my life philosophy, but I think also the frame in the book is that part of this is about holding and asking the questions. And given how big these topics that we're talking about is, it's a 216-page book, and I don't believe for a moment that I'm going to answer all these questions in this book, but the power of, by asking those questions and asking them on a personal level within the investments I'm making, and hopefully inspiring other people to engage around some of these questions, that will help to inspire entrepreneurs as they're navigating the building out of businesses, or help to inspire other investors that are thinking about how this maps to their own investment journey. And maybe in the next book I can share insights that have emerged in the sort of practical application on an ongoing basis of some of the insights.
Before we dive into a different chapter, do you mind unpacking the acronym? Because I think it's somewhat the kernel of your book.
Yeah,
So
no, for sure.
you can use me as a guinea pig. You can use the people you interviewed in the book. You can take yourself. You can take co-investors. Why do you think they're so crucial?
For sure. So to kind of walk through it. So on the hope side, and we've talked a little bit about this, but one of the things I think about there is there's a concept in the Baha'i writings around the forces of disintegration and integration in the world, and that I think in many ways it can be so easy when we look at the world and all of the terrible things we see in the news. Like, so much of it is around these forces of disintegration, and that how are we actively cultivating a focus around the forces of integration that I think really takes like hope. And it takes on a lot of what I looked at and some of the people I interviewed was around the sort of around looking at neuroplasticity and literally the practice of that cultivation of hope and how that can shift our brains and our minds as a result of that. I think the second part around empathy, that there's also I think so much of when we're engaging around these topics is that when we consider the interrelationship between us and other people in the world, that truly thinking about this as part of a human family. There's a example I share in the book from a company called Devoted Health. Again, another company that's done very well financially. They credit their success as a company to a simple exercise that they do. They encourage all of their company in the healthcare space to focus on Medicaid, and they encourage all of their healthcare providers before they engage with their patients to close their eyes and imagine that the patient that they are about to interact with is a beloved family member. And they that credit the ability to be able to do such an amazing work with their clients to this simple exercise. And I think about empathy and think about like what would it look like if within no matter what type of organization that we're part of, we were to imagine the people that we're engaging with, our customers, our partners, as beloved family members. How differently would we interact with them as a result? And so then thinking about abundance, I think so much of the world is focused around scarcity. And you think about money, and sort of money is stored energy. And what does it look like to have money? Like we think about currency, like the current, right? Like literally in movement. And I have this bracelet that I wear that says enough on it. And I think that there's so much of, particularly in Western societies, that can have this concept of like we always need more and more and more. And that I think with the abundance, it's sort of recognizing that we already have enough, and that like what does it look like to engage from that perspective. And finally to legacy, and I think a lot about a 7 generations mindset from an indigenous perspective of a consideration of 7 generations in the past and 7 generations in the future. And so what is the impact of these decisions that we're making on our great grandchildren's great grandchildren, and how do we bring that lens to the decisions that we're making? So that's a little more, and of course people have to read the book to get the real juicy juice, but that's a little bit more on each part.
Yeah. So it's interesting that you mentioned the 7 generations perspective. Let's slice that into another framework, the Horizon 1, 2, 3 framework that I'm using almost every time in the podcast. So if your life force, your network, and the book are successful, and you have beyond your imagination the ripple effects, and you stay in a short time horizon, how will your work, your book, your network, your investments decisions reform today's markets, influence today's investor decisions for the next few years?
I love that, and I think it's such an important one in terms of we've had this phrase around we're planting seeds that the trees may grow in future generations. And so I think that there's the 7 generations, and then there's exactly as you say, then okay, what does that look like? in the coming months and years that as we break that down. And a couple of pieces that come to mind. One is, much of my work is really looking at the $82 trillion in the asset management industry, and less than 2% being invested into women and people of color run companies and funds. And so this is a systemic challenge, right, that I think requires both systemic solutions as well as behavior change on the part of people that are leading some of the largest asset management firms in the industry. And one of the initiatives that I've been part of through an organization that I co-founded, Impact Experience, is we work very closely with a group called Illumin Capital that's an impact fund of funds that's focused around bias reduction. And we bring the fund managers within Illumin as well as the investors of Illumin to Montgomery, Alabama, to look at the historical context and present day realities around racial inequities and ways in which that's showing up within the asset management industry. And it's been so powerful to see people, many of whom represent institutions and are managing billions of dollars, go through these experiences and deepen their own understanding of the ways in which biases are embedded within our structures of the financial systems, and are then motivated and inspired to then look at shifting their asset allocation to increase the investments that they're making into women and people of color run companies and funds. So that's one really tangible way in which kind of think about over the coming years, how are we influencing how investments are being made, and what does that look like? And then I think also more broadly, there's a number of tools that came up in interviews that and for the book around, also in our investment decision making processes. Like there's a research partnership that we had with Illumin with Stanford, an incredible professor called Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt. She's a MacArthur Genius Award winner. She wrote a book called Biased, and she talks a lot about the power of pauses. And this, so often I think within technology, and it's all about scale and speed. And so this idea of like slowing down and creating like friction is something that seems very antithetical to the idea of growth and pursuit of growth at all costs. But actually the power of pauses, whether it's pauses before we're making investments or pauses before we're making business decisions more broadly, and how much more effective our decisions can be as a result of that. So I think about even the process of influencing how investments are made is one other area that I hope over the coming years that we begin to think about and shift within our processes.
And then curious of how much you're aware of and how many of, let's say, your colleagues, friends are experimenting with different models. So a model that I personally find very fascinating, and I can sketch you an example from a dear friend of mine, is called steward ownership. So you can make money, you can put your money into a foundation, you can write a governance codex, return the money to your investors and to yourself, cap it, and then have the rest of the ROI like circulate within the boundaries of a predefined ecosystem. And he's doing that in real estate, like large scale industrial real estate. And he's really like forging the way ahead for that in Europe. So I think I want to ask you more precisely. I think the one is more the ethics component, right? Like where you learn, you become more conscious, you heal, you balance out in your total portfolio approach, like risk, ROI, impact, minorities. I all vibe with that. And I think there comes a moment that I see few investors actually taking. It's not a normative judgment. It's more like, when comes a moment where you dare to experiment more and remove a certain aspect of yourself out of the equation, right? Which is very interesting in steward ownership, because you really hand over the ownership to an entity where you don't have a veto right. Yeah, you write that into the codex and then you cap your own ROI. So just curious, have you
Mm.
experimented with such forms yourself? Do you know people who are doing that?
100%. I love that, and I have done some work with Patagonia and actually talk about some of their model in the book and the transfer of ownership into the Holdfast Collective, and I have actually a couple of other examples in the financial services industry and actually in the hotel industry of looking at very similar structures. And I think one of the things actually has been so exciting about the last few years is that more and more organizations looking at these types of structures, and I totally think that it's the future. And a lot of what we look at in our acquisitions are, how do we think about employee ownership, and how do we have mechanisms that enable that to take place. And I think what's also interesting is the like financial literacy that often goes alongside some of these structures that can have ripple effects even outside of the direct work within the organization itself. And so I'm super excited by how much more those concepts are starting to be integrated into how people are building organizations.
Then it's almost a reverse engineering question in my somewhat 170 coachings. There came a moment, sometimes unveiled, most of the time not, if the coaches were ready. I was inviting them into a deathbed meditation. So really imagining this the end, right? This is your last breath. What have you done? And then really ask a legacy question, right? Like what do you want to leave behind? So the way you answer this question is somewhat on a spectrum if you quote unquote only take your lifetime, or if you really dare to dream even bolder, bigger, for at least I would say 7 generations ahead. So my question would be, where I don't know even your age. Let's just assume you're ballpark my age or younger, right? So let's assume you may still be living for 50 years, or you're a big fan of longevity. So then you may still be living for maybe 80 years, something like that, right? But most likely not forever. So what's your biggest hope for your own legacy? And if that were to truly ripple out for many generations ahead, what would that look like and feel like?
Mm, I think one of the things that's so powerful about the death medicine.
I think you were accidentally muting yourself, so we have to repeat that.
Oh, there we go. That's funny. The one of the key aspects, and I think about death meditation, and it's a key part of the chapter on legacy. There's just a couple of quick stories I want to share, and then I'll answer your question directly. One is I had this professor in London. His name was Dr. Peter Vardy, and he had a coffin in his office. And so when you would walk into the office, before you would see him, you would see his coffin. And his encouragement to us was to reflect every day on the fact that we're going to die one day, and what are the decisions that we make differently as a result of that. And the other is I had a chance to go through a leadership development program called the Art of Leadership that Robert Gass led, and he was actually diagnosed at one point with a disease that where he was told by his doctor that he would have a year left to live, and so he facilitates this guided meditation of for each person in the group to basically imagine that they're interacting with a doctor and they're being told that. And it was an incredibly powerful exercise for me. And he does it so beautifully in terms of imagining, what are the first feelings that you have after you're told that, from the doctor. Who do you share it with? What do you decide to do during that year? And so I often come back to exercises like that. I took a class at Stanford Business School where they had us write our obituary, and it was a similar, process of reflecting on these questions. So this is a question that I come back to a lot, and I think about a story that my grandmother told me of. She ran a store, and one day somebody came into the store and they were clearly really struggling, and she stopped everything that she was doing, and she decided to just listen to this woman and try to counsel and be just create the space for this woman to process everything that was going on in her life. And the woman came back to the store a couple of weeks later and said to my grandmother, I was thinking about taking my life that day, but spending that time with you really convinced me that I should stay alive. So thank you. And my grandmother would often share this story, and she would say, there's nothing else that I do in my life, but I created that space for this woman. Like, that's enough. And, coming back to the bracelet and enough, right? And so I think about that a lot, because I think that, so much of what I try to do on a daily basis is, influence these systems and influence the investment industry, and, try to address some of the greatest challenges in our time around climate and healthcare. And when I really think about these questions around legacy and what I would hope to see in the coming months and the coming years, it really is these much smaller things of, like being there when my mum passed away and being there when my grandmother passed away. Like, those are the moments that feel the most precious and most important. So I think it's this interplay between, coming back to this piece around, like, what is the trace that we're leaving? Like, how are we interacting with the people that we are with on a daily basis and treating them and engaging with them as, these beautiful souls that they are? And and then how does that play out in our investments and the broader systemic change that we're trying to influence?
Let's allow a bit of not knowing, tension, pain to enter this space. Unless you're one of the fully ascended masters, that doesn't feel pain or turbulence or tension. So there's a paradox that I'm chewing on since I'm alive. So fact is, the investments in impact have grown each year, pretty much since I'm alive. But at the same time, if you look at the hard numbers, climate change, biodiversity, uh, minorities, women's empowerment, um, intoxication of oceans, like all of that stuff, right? I don't need to like continue that dark rabbit hole. It doesn't really look very shiny on the horizon. So how do you hold that paradox that you light the light of hope up in yourself and inspire others, yet at the same time the collective madness seems to get worse? So how do you hold that? Need to unmute yourself again.
Weird. I think part of the challenge is that we haven't been engaging with designing solutions at the scale of the problems that exist. And I think that was, a big part of the motivation around writing the book is, how do we think about this at a larger, more systemic scale? And I think so often it may become sort of myopic around, like, this investment and this particular aspect, but how does that interplay with the vastness of the challenges that we're engaging around? And so being able to meet the challenges and be able to, like, design solutions at the scale of the challenges, I think, is a key part of being able to engage around that question.
That was a very intellectual answer. How do you process that emotionally as a human being, as a woman, in your heart, in your daily practice? Because I personally, I get a lot of compliments. People are like, I would never do what you do. Wow, this is so challenging. Like, you're so bold. And then I'm just a very hardcore disciplined person. This is my way to cope with it, like daily practice, workout, sobriety, meditation, healing modalities, nervous system regulation, like kind of all of
Mm,
it, just in
mm,
order to be able to be sensitive,
mm,
focused, but also to process the madness, right? Because I'm not
mm,
a guy
mm,
sticking my head into the sand. I mean, there's a lot of spiritual people, quote unquote, out there who don't watch the
mm,
news, right? They don't want to know it, and I also don't judge that. But I'm one of those.
mm,
I need to know certain aspects. I'm not saying I need to dive into the darkest rabbit holes of the darkest rabbit holes, like the whole Epstein madness, for example. There's some things in me where I'm like, okay, I don't think I want to click like a level deeper into that. It's just too crazy. It's just too evil,
mm,
right? For me
mm,
personally. But in my macroeconomic rabbit holes, since earliest childhood, and being born in Germany with the Holocaust background, right? I've seen like
mm.
really the dark side that makes us human, and I have that also in my soul. So how do you process that emotionally? How do you work with that as a human being?
Mm, mm. 100%. I think a number of elements that really resonate there. One is I think very similarly to how you described. There's a lot on a daily basis. A friend of mine who's sadly kind of navigating the cancer journey right now shared with me a book that I haven't read, but it's called Anti-Cancer Living, and it talks about these kind of 6 tools for if you have cancer, for reducing the impact of it, and if you don't have cancer, sort of helpful for avoiding it. And I think these 6 tools are, some embedded in what you just shared, are implicitly, I think, a lot of what I try to do, and I don't always succeed. But if I remember them correctly, one, and I think one of the most important elements is sleep. And so I really do try, and again, I'm not always successful at it, but I think there's so much that through sleep, like we're able to process, so much of what is going on during our days. And to your point, the complexity of everything that's going on in the world, and it kind of enables us to be able to show up so much more fully. So I really try to prioritize that. I also believe very strongly in the power of dreams, and so creating spaces for dreaming to take place. The other is exercise. So yeah, I work out every day. Swimming is a big part of my routine. I love playing tennis. I love hiking. Um, the third is around the thoughtfulness around what we eat. So similarly, I really try to be thoughtful about what I'm putting in taking, and the healthiness of that. And some of one of the other dimensions is around relationships and community, and I really believe strongly, and it's a huge source of my strength and kind of metabolizing comes from being in community. And the others around, reducing the toxins in our environment. And a prayer and meditation are a huge aspect for me. One dimension that I'll also add to all of this is the power of music and dance. I mentioned around some of the work we do in Montgomery, Alabama, for example, and it's deeply intense, and we're confronting some of the most, I think, depraved parts of humanity, and we always engage musicians as part of the process. And I think that music as a way of metabolizing trauma is something that's both been really helpful for me, and I think has been really powerful in the spaces that I've held. So I also I get massages regularly, and so I think all of these things, that it's like, how do we take care of ourselves so that we can come and engage around these topics from the most grounded places that we can be.
So let's bind that all together. Sometimes I do a prayer, sometimes a joint meditation. Here it feels more like I believe there's a kernel in Alistair, in you. Some say soul, right? Um, that will not really change, right? But I've changed many times. And I find it a very interesting adventure to be alive and to shed layers and to reinvent ourselves and to become stronger and bolder and fiercer and more uncompromising and more daring and more vicious and also more angry, which doesn't mean that you need to express the anger. Um, So from what you've lived so far, what is the boldest version of yourself? Like if you talk to yourself, if you do like neurolinguistic programming, what would you like to grow into? Like what's your most badass version of yourself?
Hmm. That's fascinating. I think about this sort of neurolinguistic programming. I'll as I meditate on my answer to that question, I'll share an experience that I had that I think really helped me to embody or feel closer to the embodiment of that boldest version of myself. I took part in a program called 40 Years of Zen. It's an absolutely fascinating program that is basically 5 days of neuromodulation. And I, spent hours in a day in these white pods with electrodes on my brain, and we had these guided visualizations and exercises that we would go through, and then we would come out and see our brainwave activity and reflect on what we were learning from it. And one of the key exercises that we would go through as part of this neuromodulation was around forgiveness and processing maybe more challenging experiences in our lives, both with other people but also with ourselves. And I felt as I went through that program and in processing many of these experiences and doing so in a very guided and focused environment, I felt like I was really tuning into that boldness that is within. And I think that it's something that I can feel it in moments. And I actually think, we're having this conversation and I'm in a particular moment of probably feeling one of the more connected to that boldness that I've ever been. And I think part of that in bringing this book into the world that in many ways is a very vulnerable experience to do so. It's been and I think we talked earlier about it being a sort of spiritual journey, but in many ways there's something that feels so concrete about words on a page in a way that I think so much of my life is lived in much more conversation than in the directness of words on a page. And so, but I think in doing so, it's helped me to tune into this boldness of maybe a part of the reason in being in this world is to be part of these conversations around this intersection of spirituality and purpose and business and investing. So I think that the boldness is something that I kind of tune into I try to on a daily basis, but certainly I think there are experiences and moments, and certainly this moment right now is one of them.
I have nothing to add. I have the feeling this is just the beginning of a joint journey together. I don't know if I've ever disclosed that in my podcast, but it's really interesting. Some people I meet through my podcast, and I really meet them, have never met them before. After that, we do business, co-invest, structure projects, organize conferences. And some people on my podcast I've known for years. Some are some of my
Mm,
closest
mm,
friends. So here the feeling is rather, this is just the beginning. And I'm curious
mm,
to have a deeper
mm.
conversation. I think we're already scheduled tomorrow. I forget my calendar,
Yeah.
it's too full, but we will meet sometime very soon. Curious to dig out some things we may do together. And yeah, wishing that your book has the ripple effects that you wish. Do you have any final words?
No, I'm just so grateful for this space and time, and really appreciate the opportunity here, and looking forward to continuing the conversation. So thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.